2020, our work during 2020, excuse me. Our board is comprised of members of our community, members of our elected government, members of the police department, and we work collaboratively to improve and provide better transparency in policing within our township. Actually, thank you. So we have probably today about a 40-minute presentation. The goal of today is to report out on the different areas that we've worked on in 2020. As you can see here are the topics for discussion today. We'll give a brief introduction to the board, a little quick history on the board's creation, what we actually can do legally and not do, the different areas that we've covered in the year, and then we'll wrap up with questions and comments and discussion from members of the public. So as you see here, this is an overview of our board. Kasia Pykars and I serve as the co-chairs, and we have a number of members of the community that have been active in terms of our work throughout the year. Currently, we have 2 vacancies, one being the Soma Action designated seat and the other general community seat. Our understanding is the Township Committee has been actively interviewing to fill those 2 roles and hopefully will be filled very soon. 2020 also had the board welcome our first youth representative, which is Piper Davenport. In terms of our ex officio members, we have 2 members of the Township Committee, Dean Daffis and Greg Lembrick, Deputy Chief Sally Glenn Mikulowski, and our board attorney, Ian Grodman, who advises us on our legal standing on different issues. Turning it to you, Dean.
Dean?
Dean.
You're on mute.
Sorry about that. I thought that you were going to do this part, Kasia. For some reason, my version doesn't say this, but that's okay. That's okay. Welcome everyone. And, we appreciate you coming to listen because this board is about you. This board was created to better relations between the community and the police, to make our policing better, so that policing serves the needs of the community, and the community feels more comfortable and open with its police department. The history of the board is that we started talking about having a board like this right after the terrible incident that all of us are way too familiar by now, on July 5th, 2016. The video of that incident showing law enforcement use of force in a biased manner against youth of color from our own community was released in July of 2017. That prompted the immediate resignation of the chief at the time of police, Chief Cimino, in September of 2017. And that is when community groups got together and started calling for this type of board, a board that could open the dialogue with policing, review policing, and definitely create greater transparency and accountability. And so in 2018, the governing body adopted an ordinance creating the board, and the first members of the board were appointed later in 2018 around November. And we had our first meeting in 2019, and we had our first community forum like this in early 2020. And most recently, we expanded the board to add 2 additional members. And as Ms. Scherzer indicated earlier, there are 2 current vacancies, which the Township Committee will be filling next week after interviewing a whole bunch of great community folks who raised their hands interested in doing the work of this board.
Thank you, Dean. So very quickly, we as a board want to give a foundation to explain what we can do and what we can't do. If we were to take a step back on a 10,000-foot level, there are many different, across the country, there are many different types of groups and types of versions of police civilian review boards or community boards. And so it's very important for us as we then talk about what we have done in 2020 to really explain what's on our plate and what can't be on our plate. Our focus of our board, we have a charter and there's a link here. If you click on the hyperlink, you can go to the authorizing ordinance that Mr. Daff has just mentioned. We do have a formal process for each of our meetings. We do at each of our meetings have an opportunity for members of the public to share information with us. We also have a web portal where information can be emailed to us. So in terms of our substantive work, we focus on conducting research and providing recommendations on trainings that will improve law enforcement within our community and improve programming offered by the police department. Part of our work is community education. People are very quick to say, why did the cops show up at this? But, part of that community education is, why are people calling the cops for something? So, part of our work is to get out there and educate our larger community. Our goal is to also review best practices and policies, whether it be standard operating procedures on use of force or house stops, and to be able to help our department, because there's a strong desire in our department to reimagine and be the next version of policing to help them get to that goal. It's important for us as we move forward to look at data. Data will tell us what's working, what's not working, where may be some of our blind spots. So our board has taken on the task of analyzing a significant amount of data for the public. We want to be a trusted avenue for the community, although we do have, we work collaboratively with the police department. Our goal is ultimately to serve the community. So if anyone ever wanted to talk offline with us or wanted us to have some sort of closed session to share something with us, just members of the community, no law enforcement, we are there for that purpose. And above all, we maintain strict confidentiality. When people need to call the police, it is very often for a very sensitive matter, and we want to respect members of our community. We also want to respect members of the department who are working incredibly hard to do their job well. On that end, things that we can't do. We can't make laws, we can't make rules, we can't tell the department, you have to do this. We are strictly advisory, and that's where our collaborative work, where we can show to the department that we're coming from a good place and we're trying to help them do well. That's where that collaborative relationship comes into play, because we can't dictate to them to do something. We also are not involved in personnel decisions or in ongoing internal affairs investigations.
Great. So with all of that background out of the way, we're going to now dive into what we've been working on more recently. So as we set out in 2020, we set out to run a series of different objectives. Some of these have been added on as the year has gone on. We're going to go through each one of these over the course of this presentation, but quickly we started the year really wanting to do a big focus on stops and traffic. We're going to show some of the data that we shared with the community a few months ago. We have a big initiative around use of force, which Aaron will talk about in just a second. We've been working with Captain Malloy on training, which Julie will talk about soon. Non-emergency calls. I'm not going to get into details here, but this actually came out of our police department wanting to help curb some of these non-emergency calls that they don't want to they don't want to go on. Toward the end of last year, we started a big project on integrating more social work into the community, which we'll talk about in a second. We also started to investigate police incidents near schools and the interactions between youth and police and schools, and the trifecta of what that all looks like. And then given some recent changes and from the Attorney General, we've started looking at some charter revisions. A pretty packed plate. So here we're gonna deep dive into each one of these. So I will start with talking about traffic stops. So to give some background as to why we wanted to investigate traffic stops, there are really three key reasons. The first is, traffic stops have a long history of racial discrimination that, I think we've all seen how that can lead to, often terrible consequences. So we felt it was our responsibility to understand what that looks like in Maplewood. So it starts with that. We also know, one of the biggest complaints that the Township Committee receives in general is about speeding around town. So we also wanted to, as that, interacts with police, and we felt like it was our responsibility to dig into that a little bit to make sure that the resources that are being spent by our police department are being spent responsibly when it comes to speeding. And then finally, as the community becomes more interested in topics like defund the police and understanding how our resources are being allocated, not just with speeding, but just in general, we felt like this was an important place to focus some of our energies to see, are we using our resources smartly when it comes to traffic specifically. So a little bit of background on this. In 2017, as part of the restructure of the department overall, after Chief Cimino resigned, one of the things that Chief Duvall did was create a new traffic bureau. So prior to that, traffic had all been managed within the regular rank and file. And so on every shift, there were a handful of people who were assigned to traffic. He split that out. So that way there could be a handful of officers who are purely focused on traffic, and then they could create more in-depth policies around traffic and really focus on that. So that's the first important thing to understand about our specific department. In 2018, e-ticketing was introduced, which not only made data compliance compulsory, but also made it easier for us to collect data and understand what was happening with traffic stops. Related to the speeding issue, in 2018, Maplewood Township also got some funds to conduct an in-depth traffic study to assess where the biggest needs were. So that helps us see, we can measure the needs that were identified in that traffic study against what the department is doing. And then finally, as I said last year, we really started our own data analysis, and we presented the first set of findings in September. So here I'm gonna show a handful of pieces that we shared there, but if you want to see the entire presentation, you can see it's all available there on YouTube. So to start, again, as just a quick teaser to everything that we looked at, one of the things we wanted to see is the goal of having a traffic bureau and having people, having officers. One of the main goals of having officers out on the streets is to reduce the number of accidents that happen. We want to increase safety around our town so that we have fewer both vehicular and pedestrian accidents. So we started looking at data to say, okay, are we seeing, we have a new traffic bureau, did their activity increase? Yes, you can see it did. I don't have 2020 numbers here. We'll be updating that in a few months when we do a new review, but you can see once the traffic bureau was created, naturally, we started to see more violations once there was more focus on that. And our conclusion on accidents is, jury is sort of still out on whether or not having increased patrols has an impact on the number of accidents that we see around town. Now, one could argue maybe there's a lag effect, and so this is something we'll certainly be tracking over time. But this was sort of a first view to help us see what's happening around town. From there, we did an assessment of what we were seeing for violations by race. And what we can see is that Black drivers are almost twice as likely to be stopped white drivers in our town. And one could argue, well, maybe that would be appropriate if we had twice as many Black residents, or we were close to towns that had twice as many Black residents, but that is just not true. And so this first view of seeing that just generally speaking, we're giving more violations to Black drivers than to white or other drivers, I think helps us start to paint a picture that there are some racial disparities happening here in our towns. We then presented a whole bunch of other specifics around this as we dug into why and what was happening. And so a few highlights on this. First, we can see that Black drivers are more likely to receive multiple violations. And the reason for that is because they tend to have, once you get stopped for, blowing through a stop sign or having a broken taillight or something like that, Black drivers are more likely to have documentation or violations, which means, officers don't have a discretion to not produce a violation for that. So again, you get pulled over for blowing through a stop sign, and then the officer discovers that you have a suspended license, or you don't have your license with you, or your registration is out of date, or what have you. Which then of course compounds, all kinds of issues around how much people are paying for these things, et cetera. The other thing that we learned is that these violations tend to be more concentrated on the south and east side of town. And this is in part, it's you give somebody a nail and you give somebody a hammer, and that's, then they're going to hammer that nail. We know, from talking to the department, that patrols tend to be sent out onto the south and east side of town, which is where we have higher Black populations and which border towns that have higher Black populations. So there's some, chicken and egg happening here as well, where we have far fewer patrols being sent up the hill. So as I said, there was a bunch of other data that we shared, but I'm just gonna, in the interest of moving on, just gonna share some of the conclusions that we drew from that initial round of data analysis. So first, from a public safety perspective, as I said earlier, at this point, it's pretty unclear whether increased patrols with the introduction of the Traffic Bureau has really led to an increase in public safety. So, the jury is still out, but certainly something that I think we should monitor closely, especially as we consider reassessing where we're putting our resources. And then when it comes to race, certainly, as we were patrolling areas that are more concentrated with Black populations, that's leading to having more Black drivers being pulled over than white drivers, and sort of which then is, then compounds, a variety of different issues, especially around financial distress. So one can imagine if somebody is struggling to pay for their vehicle registration, then they end up with an extra ticket for that lack of registration. We came out of that session with a handful of recommendations. First, when it comes to data, so in the course of starting to measure all of this data, we identified a number of areas that would help us understand some of these issues a little bit better. So for example, I said we know that there are a lot more violations for Black drivers for failure to exhibit documents. We don't have a lot of detail on what that is, which would help us then perhaps put policies in place that could help drivers. Recording, as you can see, I'm mostly focused when it comes to race. I'm mostly focused on Black drivers, and part of the reason for that is because it's a challenge to record Latinx drivers appropriately. So, working to introduce some policies to help us get more clarity there. There are a lot of other things that we would like to understand better. So we know what violations people are given. We don't always know what the initial reason for a stop might be. We don't have written details what the basis of a search might be, which is also really critical when we're thinking about racial disparities and traffic. And then to help us better understand what's happening from a speeding perspective, there's a lot of details that are missing. E-ticketing is great, but it's not as in depth as I think would be useful for us to really understand, okay, where are the places where there are massive speeding violations versus, looking for a reason to pull somebody over. And then from a policy perspective, as we continue to investigate this more, I think the traffic study that was done in 2018 has a lot of recommendations, a lot of which have been implemented by the township to introduce, traffic calming measures, better sight lines for pedestrians, that sort of thing. So as the township continues to think about where to put its budget, balancing that out with having more patrols on the streets is something certainly to consider. And then we had a handful of other recommendations as well. Moving forward, there's a lot of data that we weren't able to present at that initial meeting. So the plan is hopefully by March 2021, we will have looked into a handful of other issues. So there's a whole other piece to the ticketing puzzle, which is the revenue that's generated from all of these motor vehicle violations. So understanding what that looks like. Doing a deep dive on accidents and where they occur and how that matches up again with where we're putting our patrols. That's a big missing piece, and a handful of other things that we're interested in looking into this year. That is that on traffic. So I'm going to hand it over to Erin to talk about use of force.
Thank you, Kasha. So before I go through a summary of the Maplewood Police Department's use of force in 2020, I wanted to take a step back and first very briefly explain to the community, why we're looking at use of force. Also, what are the kind of the larger standards on use of force within the state. So first, why are we looking at use of force? The board actually started and it was created in response to a horrible use of force, multiple use of force instances in our township, which was caught on camera following the July 5th fireworks in 2016. The New Jersey Star-Ledger did an incredible journalistic report analyzing every police department and also the state police regarding use of force in New Jersey over the course of 5 years, I believe. This is a situation, force is what, everyone fears when there may be a negative interaction with law enforcement. And so it is incredibly important that we take the use of force seriously. We take the training and resources there seriously as well, and that we work on trying to minimize force as much as possible. I do want to state that officers by law, under being deputized through the state of New Jersey, they are able to use force, and force is permissible, and there are circumstances where it is okay. The level of force has to meet the force that they're presented with. So if somebody, for example, if somebody is drunk and belligerent and an officer needs to respond, the response is not a gun. It's something much lower, a verbal warning, starting even just presence to be able to respond to that situation. However, if an officer is responding to a situation and someone has presented a weapon or is believed to present a weapon or body armor, then yes, in that case, a weapon would be. So it's force meeting force in the scenario. The state of I will mention at the end of my slide that the New Jersey Attorney General's office recently, and by recently it was right before Christmas 2020, amended its directives on use of force. So going ahead, we will work with the department in terms of modifications that may happen there. But I will say, even before these modifications, the Maplewood Police Department required reporting above what the state requirement is. And that's a good thing. And we want we want our department to be as transparent as possible. So for example, I don't want to comment on the current directives because I personally have not had a chance to go through it with a full deep dive, but for all of 2020, pretty much, in the state of New Jersey, if an officer drew their weapon and did not actually fire it, that's called constructive authority. They're not required by state directive at the time throughout most of 2020 and before to actually report that on a use of force form. In the township of Maplewood, that has always been the policy. So we do want to applaud the department for having policies that are above what state is required by state, so that we could monitor things going forward. I just want to also be clear with the public in terms of how the department reviews use of force as it comes in. So let's say an incident happens in the community, and as soon as the officer comes back to the department and is filling out all their, there's a lot of paperwork that gets filled out when they're back at the department. One of those forms is a use of force form. All of our police officers are required to wear body cameras. And so what happens is that form is reviewed and the video image is reviewed by that officer's immediate superior officer. And Deputy Chief Sally also reviews all instances of use of force. He also examines all sorts of videos and other things just to see what's going on. And then on top of that, and this is where I come in and the board comes in, is that the board itself reviews these documents. Now our review is lagged because there's a whole bunch of internal reviews that have to happen first before it can actually come to us. So we're always going to be a quarter behind. So we not only review the paper reports, but one of our findings after 2019, was that looking at the paper reports was not sufficient enough for us as a member of the community to really understand what was going on. A piece of paper can't tell you what de-escalation tactics might have been used or could have been used. It won't tell you what may have been going on in the scenario. So we as a board decided in late 2019 that going forward in 2020 that we would also review video. So I'll talk to you a bit about what I reviewed for this year and what will be going ahead. So for quarters 1 and quarters 2, that would be basically from January, any incident that happened between January and June, I reviewed both the paper reports and also the video that accompanied those almost all of the videos. There was one that we had trouble finding, and that was just, it was lost in the video archive there. And then for Q3, which would be from June to the end of September, I could only review paper. It's just, as y'all know, it's just the COVID numbers have gone up and it's just would not be responsible to have additional visitors in the police department. So I will review that as soon as it's safe to do so. So let's take a look at the stats here, and then I will review Q4 in early 2021, and that will just be our ongoing cycle going forward. So in terms of statistics, we are noticing, at least through the third quarter, that the number of incidents involving use of force is lower than in the prior years that we've examined. I believe the first year when I looked at it, it was 32 incidents, then it went to 30. 2019, we had 26 incidents, and as of end of September, we were at 19. Now, I hope this is a positive trend going forward. We obviously want to use less force. We also have to acknowledge that it's a global pandemic, and the world's different for everyone. So, we'll just have that there. On average, the same number of officers responded per use of force. So even though I have stated there's 19 incidents, within that incident, there could be multiple officers using force. So that trend has stayed the same, about 2 to 3 officers per instance, sometimes a little less, sometimes a little bit more, but that's about the average. But I will note that there was a noticeable increase in the number of officers responding when I looked at the paper data for Q3. Now I haven't been able to see the video yet, so the video may give me some information that it was okay to have that many officers there. So I don't want to I don't want to prejudge the situation until my eyeballs are on it, but I do want to note, at least on paper, that there was definitely a noticeable trend. And so that will be something that that I'll be looking at a little more closely once I can get access to the video. Other information, so officers are called, and you'll hear more about this from my colleagues Stephanie and Piper as they talk about the social work initiative within from the board and with the Township of Maplewood. But our police officers are called to all sorts of instances. You also hear this from Paul as he talks about non-emergency 911 calls. So far in uses of force, 10 of those situations involve something that could lead to an arrest. So something that could be perceived as criminal activity, whether it was a attempted armed situation, a theft, something like that. And there were 9 situations where it would never lead to arrest. So let's say maybe somebody publicly intoxicated or someone emotionally distressed. Most of the incidents involved compliance hold, which is a non-lethal way of, or could potentially be non-lethal, though if used incorrectly could be lethal, to gain control of someone, whether it's guiding their arm a certain way and moving their body in a certain way. Those were most of the instances. There were a couple of constructive authorities involving weapons. Both of those instances, the call came in that someone was armed. So just wanted to clarify there. There were a couple of takedowns as well. I will say overall, by reviewing the video, our officers did a great job using the use of force continuum. The use of force continuum is think of it as a graduated scale of how one should apply force, starting with the lowest, which being just physical presence, maybe surveying the area before stepping in, then using verbal, then moving up to non-lethal forms, and then ultimately at the end using a lethal form of force. So the way I review videos, I watch the lead up and then during and after, and I thought our officers, at least the video that I saw, had done a good job assessing the situation and it's attempting to use the least amount of force possible in the situation. And it was in one of the instances, the individual in the community that they were interacting with continued to kind of amp it up, and the officer, you could see them, like it's almost as if you could see the step-by-step as the officer said, first Maplewood Police, this, then this, and then you actually had the physical form of contact. So, that is a trend that, it's actually nice to see. And it's unfortunate that force had to be used, but it is good that our officers use the appropriate steps that should have been used under the circumstances. I did want to comment to the community that overall, the verbal communication skills used by our officers to de-escalate situations was actually, they did it incredibly well. Engaging people as people, even people who may be pushing back on them and making comments that, trust me, if they were made to me, I would have told somebody off. But instead, responding back in a very not just professional way, but in a more of an inviting way to try to get that person to de-escalate and they themselves. So I did want to acknowledge that the department, at least on the video I saw through Q1 and Q2, it was that's a positive trend, and I hope we can keep that going. Looking ahead, the hope is to help officers find more de-escalation training, including also more training in terms of how to report out what they may be seeing, not seeing, things like that, and also working with the department leaders and officers on incorporating the new Attorney General directives on use of force. So that's all I have. I'll turn it to Julie on 2020 training.
Hi, everyone. So we have a new officer in charge of training at the Maplewood Police Department this year. Her name is Captain Malloy. And so she has taken over training, and she has a very receptive sort of view. Our role, just so people know the role of the Maplewood Police Board with training with the Maplewood Police Department, is that we can make recommendations to them of different types of trainings that we would like to see. the police department undergo. So far, Captain Malloy has been very receptive to suggestions. We went over with her the trainings that she's been able to conduct thus far this year. There has been an impediment, and that is COVID. When the shutdown happened, a lot of outside agency trainings were canceled. She has reported that they're trying to get it on track, doing things virtually, but a lot of her plans for the year in terms of like expanding and broadening out training were stymied because of the circumstances. But still, there are examples. Last year they were able to put together some trainings based on community feedback about people with who suffer from autism spectrum disorder. This year, a community member who has expertise in elder abuse was able to meet with Captain Malloy about putting together a training on that topic specifically. This is a department that's open to suggestions from the community about how they can make training better for the officers. And we continue to work with them and have suggestions, and we invite the community to participate in our meetings and to offer ways that we can offer suggestions for the department as well. One other topic that we undertook as a part of training this year was that we invited members of a national program called LEAD, to do a presentation at our one of our meetings. LEAD stands for Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion. It's basically a program that started in Seattle and exists now in hundreds of cities and towns across the country, that goes further than just training officers to be better, more receptive to community sensitivities. It really speaks to the role of law enforcement itself. So we started to think about, especially this summer when people were talking about all of the, issues around police brutality and how we could rethink the role of police departments, of how we could bring a program like this to Maplewood or to New Jersey. There are no LEAD programs in New Jersey so far. And what LEAD is really, if it were implemented, it would mean that for certain enumerated offenses, at the point of contact with the officer, a social worker would intervene instead of the officer. An officer would contact a social worker and intervene, and that type of case would never be a part of the criminal justice system. It would get diverted into this LEAD program instead, and successful participants would never be prosecuted. It just wouldn't be criminalized. We're starting to take, I think, and this is going to be talked about later in the presentation, a smaller step that we can really do as a community toward this, I think, with the evolution of the social work program that I know other members are going to talk about. The LEAD program is kind of like a broader long-term ask that probably involves state input as well, but it is something that we, as a board, I think, are contemplating. And I think that, having more social workers involved in the department is a minor step towards that, not a minor step, but an important step towards that. But doesn't solve the issue of the criminalization itself of these offenses. Anyway, but I did want the board to know that there are these alternative ways of thinking about policing, that people are thinking about that in other parts of the country, so that we as a board, in our role as recommending policies, not just to our own police department, but to county and state actors, can advocate for a real, larger rethinking of the role of police in our community as a long-term goal. Okay, I'll turn it over to the next presenter.
All right, great. So hello, everyone. Paul Williams. One of the other things that we looked at were non-911 police calls. And really, there were two things that we wanted to look at. One is around kind of the effectiveness and the use of resources around these calls. And then the second was around racial bias. And we wanted to understand if there was racial bias around these calls. And so we, as you'll see in a second, we looked into the data around the calls. And what we did find was a pretty compelling level of racial bias, actually probably even higher than we anticipated. In 2018, there were about 243 suspicious person calls that were made to the non-emergency police line. These are when someone kind of picked up the phone and said, "Hey, I see somebody walking around. I see someone sitting in a car, and it looks like they're up to something." And of those, 73% of the time, the person was Black or Hispanic. And as you guys are well aware, that does not match at all the demographics of our town. And what was notable is that none of these calls actually led to an arrest. So in most of these cases, it's a person like waiting for the bus or walking their dog or sitting in front of a car, sitting in a car in front of a place where they have lived for a long time. And so as a result of this, there's kind of two elements of this. One is that this wastes resources for the police officers. The other is that it creates an interaction between a community member and a police officer that has the potential to then get escalated in some way. And so, and it also causes residents who have these calls placed on them, particularly residents of color, to feel, unwanted, or like that there's something that they're being held with suspicion in the community that they live in. So we wanted to figure out a way to address this. To be good to the next one, we've started an education campaign that is ongoing, where what we want to do is start to redirect these calls, and then we also want to educate folks on to do a little bit of like a decision tree before they place the call. What we're really trying to do is educate community members on first, where's the most efficient direction to go in if they do have a need. So for example, if there's a call about an obstruction on the sidewalk, or if there's a landlord issue or something like that, make sure that folks are informed about where they can actually go. And then also asking folks to do some thinking before they place a call about a suspicious person, basically taking a few seconds to say, essentially, like, would I feel comfortable with someone calling the police on me for doing this thing? Like if I were sitting in my car, or if I'm walking my dog around the same block twice, is that really a suspicious thing? We obviously don't want to dissuade people from calling the police if there's a need. So also kind of giving them some criteria of things to look for, like is someone checking car doors, or walking down the street, walking on multiple porches and things like that. That is actually a suspicious thing. But so we started, we developed the one pager that you see on the right of the slide here that gives a little bit of education on what the thought process should be, as well as what the correct contact numbers are. And then we are working on a video that we will get out hopefully very soon, that just makes it clear, kind of the same messaging for folks, but in a video format. And again, I would say this one is as much about, or probably more about, community education than it is about practices of the police department. In fact, the police department is very supportive of this, because these types of calls divert their resources away from more critical and more serious issues. So stay tuned for you will continue to issue the one pager, and stay tuned for the video to come out soon.
I would say the one thing that's been really great about this is that these numbers have definitely seeped into the community. So we're grateful to Mayor McGee. He used this flyer. He talks very openly about this and frequently about this sort of thing. And I see it reported back, through social media, where people are like, have you heard how many calls are made? So, personally, I think this whole effort has been really terrific.
Great, thanks. So I'll pass it over.
Hi everyone, I'm Piper Davenport, and I'm going to just introduce the social work initiative to everyone. So in the past year, obviously there has been a greater push both nationally and then with our own community from the department and community members to have a social worker more present on rapid emergency response scenes for the purpose of de-escalation. To this end, in October of 2020, 3 models were presented by a board of community social workers, and they were proposed to the Community Board on Police as potential changes and initiatives that we can integrate into our own system. At the end of that meeting, which happened in October, there was a decision by the board and a vote to go with numbers 2 and 3, I believe it was, and that is the decision to embed the social worker within the fire department and the EMT system instead of within the police department. They would still be working closely with the Maplewood Police Department, but we decided that it was best practice for them to go with the fire department and EMTs. At that point, then there was also a subcommittee that was generated, which is comprised of me, Tom, and Stephanie. And we have been working closely in the past months to figure out the best layout for our recommendation to the Township Committee. We have also created a draft document detailing how we want to go about this process, and Stephanie in the next slide is going to go over the basic work streams that we've worked out are necessary so that we can move on. I also want to bring up something that's important, is that in December of 2020, so that was last month, the Township Committee had a discussion and made the decision to establish a steering committee that is the government half of this project. So this project is comprised of our subcommittee within the community board, and then the steering committee, which helps us with all the logistical things on the government end. And then that's that part.
Thanks so much, Piper. So as Piper mentioned, we're creating this document and there's multiple components, first of which the mission statement, where we essentially define the purpose and what we have to do to achieve it. And Piper is working greatly on that. And then we have a needs assessment, and within the needs assessment, we're actually defining a criteria for determining what the community needs, and making contacts with programs like the Loft, the Parenting Center, Family Connections. Piper's working there as well. We know as well we'll need to data mine calls to the Maplewood PD and establish a routing hierarchy for these calls. And we imagine that would be a partnership of sorts. And we also have a dispatch checklist, just something for consideration, not knowing yet all the details of how the dispatch works. So that's an appendix to our document. In terms of community engagement, obviously we want to know from the community what they feel is needed in terms of a social worker and the types of calls to which they would be responding. Schools and police interactions were definitely high on the list. And then with the hiring process, as mentioned, they would be situated with fire and EMT, but we wanted to look at the criteria for the social workers if we were going to have an emphasis on bringing in male social workers, what sort of KPIs, judgments, grades do we want to have in terms of their performance, perhaps something like decreased calls from the same household, or fewer referrals for police assistance, and just a reduction in certain types of complaints. The cost implications will largely be handled with the town, but we'll do what we can to work with the township CFO, and any sort of questions regarding location, where they physically work out of, depending upon who they're partnering with, general work time, and additional needs like a township vehicle or what might happen during overnight hours. And of course, with operationalizing, we wanted to make sure that there were performance measures for all the stakeholders, that being more than just the social workers and fire and EMT, but also the police department and the township, each having their own responsibility, and perhaps having a leadership board that would include individuals from the board on police to help look at procedures and accountability. We know there was a strong desire to have cross-training between the social worker and the police department in terms of de-escalation, but still not sure on the specifics there in regards to training and if that has to come from the academy or if that could come from an individual as well. And then perhaps having satisfaction surveys really for the officers and the social worker as well to see if it's in fact working as they would desire, if they're able to pull back and allow the social worker to take a controlling force on site. So we're really excited about it and we look forward to bringing it to life this year.
Great. So one of the things that we've taken on in the past year, continuing on into this coming year, is an investigation around police incidents near schools, in particular the number of incidents when police are called to engage with students. There's a couple of reasons why we're looking into this. One is there's been a lot of concern raised by parents, both nationally and very much locally, around the police presence on campus. And then there has been also a lot of concern, including locally, around racial bias in terms of discipline in general in the Som School District, but specifically around the engagement of police for discipline of youth within the district. So we started with an initial data analysis that the police department actually does a very good job of capturing all of the data around when there is an incident. And so we have very detailed data by school, by type of incident, including demographic data around the gender and the age of the folks involved when the calls are made. And so we've done some analysis into that. We did find some interesting findings. So for example, Black students are 25% of the South Orange Maplewood School District, but represent 45% of the police contacts. And when you look at, when you get to the high school level at Columbia, it goes up to 57%, which was very interesting. And then, while there's a really good classification system, it looks like there's probably some opportunity there's two things. There's an insight in the classifications, and then there's probably some opportunity to improve it. What I mean by that is if you look at the classifications, there are some of them that are kind of subjective. So you'll see things like assault not atrocious, or trespassing and defiant, suspicious conditions. And definitely the data shows that Black students over-index on those ones that are subjective. So when you say like threats, what constitutes a threat or what's non-atrocious? And so we wanted to look into that a little bit more. If you look at the data by school, as you would expect, there's significantly more contact at basically as the kids get older, so in the elementary school, there's not that much. You see more in middle school, and then by far more in the high school, which is kind of, not a surprise. In terms of our next steps, particularly based on the observations that we saw in the data, what we want to do is dig into it a little bit further to understand those initial observations. We'll be working with the police department has an officer who's committed to working with students in the schools. So we want to set up a follow-up conversation with him to understand more about how those designations are assigned. We want to look at the process itself and probably make some recommendations around adjustments to how that data is captured. And then we'll do a focus group of students, teachers, and police officers to look for if there are alternatives to the way that the work is currently being done, or if there are improvements to the way that we can engage, when needed. So those are kind of three key next steps for us on this initiative. Okay, so turn it over to Julie.
Okay, so I'll let Dean talk about some of the specifics here, but I'll just do an overview on this subject. So we are considering some revisions to the charter that Aaron discussed at the outset, and that is based on guidelines that were issued this summer by the Attorney General's office in response to a lot of the uproar over the murder of George Floyd. And others, and the general movement for accountability for police officers. And the guidelines addressed a number of things having to do with transparency in the police accountability process, And one of the things that was addressed in those guidelines was the role of boards like ours in this process. And previously, it had really been unclear. There is some litigation going on over it still, but the AG gave us a good sense of what a board like ours can be in a community in terms of our role in assessing or giving recommendations on individual police encounters. So the bottom line is, and I'll let Dean get into this a little further and what we've been discussing, and Aaron as well, but it gives us broader powers than we currently have under our charter. And also there are some things that we've learned just by being a board for this long about, needing access to certain documents that we don't have right now, that we would like to explore. And these are documents or information that a member of the community would have access to doing an Oprah request. And we would like to have, as a board, that same level of, of access and transparency. So we're thinking along those lines. How can our role be consistent with the Attorney General guidelines? How can we, better serve the community by just making some small changes in the charter that just make sense now that we know sort of how our role functions and the review that we're being asked to do. Dean.
Thanks, Julie. And I think you covered most of this. Our charter was always meant to be a living document, like any other charter should be, a good charter. Certainly when we started with our board, we were the only such board in New Jersey suburbia. Since then, many similar boards like ours have popped up, including next door in our neighboring sister town, South Orange. So we always meant to evolve and to do so in a way that allows us to better serve our community and to make our policing more effective and more welcoming and more professional, right? So as Julie referred to, there's been a ton of changes in a very short period of time at the state level in terms of policing reforms, use of force, new policy directives, including making certain disciplinary records public records. And requiring disclosures of law enforcement agencies annually about certain incidents that cause certain types of discipline to officers. Currently, we have no access to personnel records. Also, the New Jersey Supreme Court handed down a decisive victory for civilian review boards across the state. It not only solidified their existence, but it also framed their powers and duties. And so we're going to be looking into how we could do better what we do now, after especially 2 years of experience, streamline our process internally in terms of data review and access, and how we can align our powers and responsibilities with some of these new directives and the New Jersey Supreme Court's decision. Wouldn't want to misinform or overpromise or mislead at this point, because we actually haven't made any decisions. But we will be having this conversation this year and moving forward, as we always do, with lots of public comment, discussion. Our meetings are always open to the public. We also discuss this work. We carry it over to the Public Safety Committee, which is also a public meeting. And of course, myself and my co-liaison on the governing body, Mr. Lembrick, always bring this back to the governing body and the general public during those public meetings. So this is going to be a collective decision of charter revisions, which will make what we do stronger and better. And we know already, based on preliminary discussions with our police department, these will also be revisions that they're going to have, that they're going to approve and have buy-in in. So since the beginning, we built credibility with our police. We've built credibility with the community. It is a collaboration. And that's how we're going to carry forward because we want this to continue being a successful effort. Erin?
Just wanted to wrap up very quickly what Julie and Dean have stated. And in that the goal here is to continue our collaboration. We've built trust, and there definitely was not trust in the beginning. I'm going to be completely transparent. And we have worked incredibly hard as a board to build that trust both with the community and with the department. And this is the next step in the journey, because one thing that we as a board have been privileged to see is what the department wants to be as a department. They don't want to be defined by what was visualized on July 5th. They want to be that next generation of a public servant, and these revisions will help all of us be able to do that, and do so in a supportive way that we have done so far.
All right, so with that, I want to talk a little bit about where we're hoping to go. This is not at all final. In fact, we were supposed to talk about this at our first meeting a couple of weeks ago, which also happened to be the day of the insurrection. So we decided to table that discussion until our February meeting. So if you'd like to participate in this conversation, please, for members of the community, I welcome you to come. It's the first Wednesday of February, 7:30 p.m. It will be hosted by Zoom. But, so there may be other things that are added to this list, potentially, but, you can see we're sort of continuing a lot of the work that we started in 2020 into 2021. A lot of these issues are things that take time to really do well. And so I personally am really excited about being able to take a lot of these things further. So with that, I think, the only thing that we haven't really talked much about as far as 2021 is community outreach. And this is something that I think we all would like to do a lot more of. We had big ambitions to do a lot of this last year. And then, of course, the pandemic hit, and which made it a challenge to do a lot of physical community outreach. That being said, we would love to do more of this. So our board meetings are held usually on the first Wednesday of every month. If that's not the case, that will all be made public on the public township calendar. The public is welcome. Please come. We'd love the public to come. We'd love to hear your questions. So that's the first place for the public to come to us. We are also happy to come to you. So we, in the past, have presented at a couple of different places. We would love to do more of that. So whether that's local groups, whether that's local neighborhood groups, schools, all kinds of things, we're happy to participate and bring what we know and take your questions in a smaller, more intimate forum. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us. And you can always, get in touch with us anonymously or otherwise. We have a web form available through the township website on the Community Board of Police website. As I said, you can put something in there anonymously if that makes you feel more comfortable. But we'd love to get your feedback and your questions there as well. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing the document, and we welcome questions from the public. So in order to ask a question, you need to raise your hand, and then we will allow you to open. And looks like we've got one hand raised. Bear with me because I am learning how to moderate this. Okay, so we've got Bridget Bross. If you can unmute and you go ahead and ask your question. There you go. You'll need to unmute yourself, I believe. Bridget, are you there? Did you have a question?
Looks like she's still on mute. Maybe she can put it in the chat instead.
I think I'm doing this right. I did unmute. Bridget, are you there?
I wonder if she has to unmute her. Oh, there she is.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I did not intend to raise my hand, and I had a little technical difficulty there. I'm sorry,
okay.
but I do not have a question. But
Okay.
I did love the presentation. Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you, Bridget. Tasha, there's one in the, I don't know if you can, I'm sure you can see it on your
Yeah,
end.
so then there's a question in the chat. I can read this out loud for everybody who can't see it. And this was in response to the traffic piece of the presentation, saying stop signs are ignored throughout town, which we all know is true. This must be stopped. Can we have civilian traffic officers? And I believe, not sure if Ted is volunteering or is a volunteer. I don't know if anybody wants to comment on that.
Well, I don't know if Dean could comment from the volunteer perspective, but I'll speak very high level. The Township Committee in the fall has streamlined all police operation to individuals who are basically on payroll, our paid law enforcement department. The town suspended the auxiliary force in the fall period. Dean, I don't know if you want to talk a bit more, but in terms of traffic enforcement, it is an ongoing conversation in terms of balancing enforcement with also not over policing as well. So above all, we want everybody safe.
Yeah, Erin, I don't have anything to add to that. I think you covered it really well. It's a balancing act, and we are looking into how we can do this better, and how we can possibly even engage volunteers in a way that makes sense. Certainly, in some communities that are moving even farther into police reforms, some communities are also not doing traffic stops at all, using police. So, I mean, I'm not suggesting that that's what we're going to do in Maplewood. We haven't even talked about anything like that. I'm just, saying that, we're definitely looking into other ways to engage volunteers who are from the community and who are not armed.
And then there's a question here, can we request the slides for further review? So we will have both the presentation and the slide deck will be added to our portal of the website. And then I believe also the full presentation will be on YouTube, but hopefully I'm not speaking out of turn on that.
That's correct.
And we'll blast those out into the community as soon as they're up.
All right, does anybody have any other questions? Please raise your hand, or you can put a question into the chat. Going once, going twice. Okay, with that, I think we can conclude our annual presentation from the Maplewood Community Board on Police. Thank you, everybody who came to attend. We really, as I can't say this enough, we really welcome the community to participate, to comment. So, please don't hesitate to follow up with us afterwards. We're here for you. So we want to hear from you. We have a lot of work that we want to get done in this coming year and the years following. I personally am really excited. I feel like we are still just getting started, but I feel the momentum. So I'm excited to kick it off. And otherwise, we'll see everybody first Wednesday of February. Thank you. Bye.